Hello dear attendees, my name is Nicolas Weller, partner at Altaïr, and welcome to this presentation called Longevity Risk, Modeling, Valuation and Hedging. This is nothing else than my master thesis I have presented under the supervision of Mrs. Jennifer Alonso Garcia to obtain the title of actuary. The starting point of this presentation will be the description of the huge issue, hence the shape of the rectangle, faced during such a thesis, the longevity risk. Then, from this description, we will see what we'll get as output in order to go further. All of us have already had this thought, or even this innate desire of living longer than expected. Indeed, decades after decade, such a feature appears more and more often and is not surprising anymore. This can be illustrated with a couple of figures based on Belgian population and mortality data coming from the Human Mortality Database. The first figure shows that life expectancy at birth of Belgian men and women has improved dramatically, with a still very clear disparity of women regarding men, even if this trend has diminished over the last few years. Findings on the life expectancy curve can be found back on the last two graphs. The first one represents the evolution of mortality, where curves have the typical form of a hook and shift downwards over time. We notice several phases in the evolution of mortality rates, namely that they are high early in life, they reach their lowest levels during childhood, they are illustrated in the form of an accident bump during adolescence, characteristic of the increased number of suicides, fatal accidents, and other events at this age. And they progress more regularly during adulthood. The final graph represents the evolution of survival functions, where curves tend to rectangularize and shift this time to the right over time. Indeed, individuals are still alive until all ages before dying, which makes these curves tend more and more towards a rectangular shape. Therefore, such a risk should not be neglected, because from the point of view of the individual himself, he may not know how much to save today in order to adequately fund his pension in the future, the catastrophic solution being to find himself completely short of money after this pension. And from the point of view of governments, via the statutory pension funds and insurance companies or even corporates, typically through a pension plan defined towards its employees, reserves will need to be set aside to respect these payment promises, and it is therefore imperative and crucial for these entities to manage such a risk in order to avoid paying much more than what was planned, and therefore ending up with insufficient funds. So now that the problem of longevity risk has been well depicted, the quantity that will be of interest right now is TPX, representing the probability that an individual age X is still alive at age X plus T. We will need to model it accurately, and two questions therefore arise. First, which models are we going to use? And second, what we will get this time as outputs. The essence behind mortality modeling resides in equation 1. The idea won't be to model the survival probability directly, but instead we will model the parameter μx, called the instantaneous mortality rate or force of mortality at age x, and then calculate the right-hand side to obtain the survival probability. Thus, let us now focus on μx. Historically speaking, De Moivre was the first to postulate some dynamics for it. In 1724, he supposed that the lifespan of an individual was uniformly distributed between age 0 and an ultime age omega. The force of mortality is therefore a function increasing with age. However, such a law very badly corresponds to the observed mortality. That's why Gompertz hypothesized in 1824 that the force of mortality increased exponentially with age. such law better accounts for the observed mortality. Nonetheless, this is not yet satisfactory. Finally, Meckham modified in 1860 Gompert's law by adding to the initial force of mortality, playing the role of the aging component, an age-independent term supposed to reflect the mortality from accidents. The main issue with this expression is that the force of mortality μx only depends on x. This will lead to static or periodic or instantaneous life tables where the mortality of any age class is known in advance, which is a quite unrealistic assumption. This is why we will now consider μx as stochastic at some future date. This means that we do not know if the mortality in x years of an age class will still be the same as the one prevailing today. Before delving into stochastic mortality modeling, let us first deal with a couple of assumptions that needed to be made. First, it is legitimate to wonder if it is more interesting to select a longer or shorter observation period within the stochastic models. As there is no right or wrong answer to this question, the choice is focused on a 21-year time horizon between 1998 and 2018, in order to avoid large mortality shocks that various unusual events can cause, like the Spanish flu, the First and Second World Wars, etc., and have data deemed to be the most recent and plausible in order to simulate future mortality, taking into account a much more declining mortality recently than before, as well as the reduction in the gender gap seen with the life expectancy at birth. Let us recall and insist on the fact that this choice is purely subjective. Finally, a similar subjective approach has been undertaken for the choice of the age group. It has been decided to delete all ages under 25 in order to get rid of the famous accident bump that could bias the result of future forecasts, and to remain consistent with the framework of life annuities pricing, in which such a longevity risk fits by keeping all the upper ages. Now, on this 3D graph, being the same as before but for several years, we see a troublesome phenomenon appearing at all ages, namely the lack of raw data of quality. This leads us to the problem of table closure and to the need of extrapolating this data to these advanced ages. It has been decided to use the Cole-Kisker method starting from age 80 based on empirical studies. But at which age do we stop the extrapolation? Since there is no real consensus within the actuarial community, the subjective decision to set it at 110 years has been taken. We clearly see the effect on the right figure. We will start stochastic mortality modeling with a discrete time model, the most famous of them and the most used in practice, the Lee-Carter model, described by equation 5, breaking down mortality rates into various components. A first parameter alpha x, describing average mortality over time, a second parameter beta x, giving the evolution of mortality at the age level, and thus the real speed of decline, and a last parameter kpt, describing the evolution of mortality over time. Now we can estimate these parameters numerically, and regarding alpha x, we observe the usual characteristic already seen before, except the infant mortality and the accident bump around 20-25 years given of previous choice made on the age group. And regarding beta x and kpt, a decrease in mortality over time appears given the observed decrease in kpt. This drop in mortality rates is particularly apparent among young people in view of the large beta x, and is no doubt the consequence of the progress made in medicine in terms of infant and juvenile mortality. Then, on the other hand, the evolution attenuates as soon as one exceeds 60 years, until becoming approximately constant over time near extreme ages. Finally, we see on the 3D surface that there is a marked improvement after smoothing the mortality rates using the Lee-Carter model. Now we need to extrapolate future rates using KPT. The implementation of an ARIMA extrapolation of KPT allowed us to obtain the figures on the left, for male, for female, and both combined. By the way, this ARIMA extrapolation is the reason behind the stochasticity of the Lee-Carter model and behind its discrete time nature. This gives the complete prospective life table on the right, extended from 2018 to 2078. Let us now pursue with a continuous time model. We can use typical models prevailing for interest rates because actuarial analogies exist between the instantaneous, mortality, and interest rates. But the choice ended upon a model, the Feller process, taking into account two particular features of mortality: the absence of mean reversion term in the drift of the equation, because once progress in medicine allows improvements in mortality, it would take wars, pandemics, or natural disasters to go backwards, and the force of mortality necessarily non-negative thanks to the square root in the diffusion term of the equation. Then, maximum likelihood estimation has been chosen to calibrate Feller parameters, and we obtain results quite in line with the literature. This allows to get a similar, complete prospective life table as before with Lee-Carter. Back to our storyline, where we can now answer quite trivially the two previous questions. We have used the Lee-Carter and Feller stochastic models in order to get as outputs Lee-Carter and Feller survival probabilities respectively. Now, these probabilities will be used in the context of valuation of longevity-linked derivatives. So the same two questions arise. Which valuation method are we going to use? And what are we going to obtain as outputs? When it comes to insurance-based securities, they lie by nature in incomplete markets. Indeed, their cash flows may depend on hurricanes and earthquakes for non-life insurance risks, and on longevity and mortality for life insurance risks, for example. In general, traditional assets such as stocks and bonds are usually used to build a portfolio that is able to approximate the risk considered. However, it is impossible for the aforementioned risk. There exist a few methods for valuation in incomplete markets, and the choice ended up on the Wang Transform, described by equation 7. The basic idea is to obtain, thanks to the market price of risk lambda being positive or negative, new survival probabilities that are more prudent so as to follow a market consistent approach by loading products in the same way financial markets charge prices. The problem in equation 7 is that it is a unique equation with two unknowns: the new survival probabilities and lambda. A common practice is therefore to first calibrate lambda on the annuities market. This is the purpose of equation 8, with an annuity price given by equation 9, and the 1-year survival probabilities P market in equation 10 are computed according to rules recommended by the Belgian regulatory authorities using conservative life tables such as MR-5, in which individuals are made 5 years younger in order to take into account the adverse selection present in the annuity market. We notice that these probabilities are in fact computed according to the Mekern model mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. We can now assess the impact of the Wang transform onto survival probabilities coming from the Lee-Carter model. We first graph these and clearly notice the rectangularization occurring over time. Then, due to the negative value of lambda coming from the calibration on the annuity market, survival probabilities are shifted downwards as expected. In the Feller case, a strange phenomenon appears as we clearly notice an incorrect derectangularization occurring over time. In fact, this might be due to the extremely low calibrated value of the parameter sigma, here, coming from the maximum likelihood estimation and killing completely the second term in equation 6. Then, we see that the positive value of lambda probably due to the failure probabilities going in the opposite direction compared to the Lee Carter ones, shift survival probabilities upwards. Back to our storyline again, where to our initial Lee Carter and failure probabilities, we have applied the Wang Transform in order to get more conservative probabilities. However, due to the strange phenomenon appearing in the failure case, we will only use the Wang transformed Lee Carter probabilities for the final part of these studies related to the hedging matter. We will now put ourselves in the setup of an annuity provider, such as an insurance company or a pension fund, issuing a certain number N of annuities to a cohort of individuals retiring at age 65 years old in 2018. Therefore, in terms of liability, the annuity provider will have to pay one monetary unit at each policy holder if the latter is still alive at the end of the year. Thus, the liability side is linked to a real survival probability, and we will approximate it with the Lee Carter one. And in terms of assets, the annuity provider will receive a single premium by each policy holder. Thus, the asset side is linked to an expected survival probability, and we will approximate it with the MR1. So the annuity provider can suffer from a potential loss given by the difference between the Lee Carter and MR probabilities multiplied by the number N if this difference is positive. We will therefore see what type of hedging instruments the annuity provider can use to protect himself and which conclusion can we draw from these hedges. We will suppose that the annuity provider would like to get rid of this potential loss by transferring it to the capital markets through the use of either a longevity swap or a longevity bond. In the longevity swap case, the annuity provider will receive from his counterparty the variable amount he has to give to each insured, so the one linked to the Lee Carter probability, in exchange of a fixed amount linked to the MR probability. However, such an amount will not be judged sufficient by the swap counterparty, as he would like to be compensated for being ready to accept such a longevity risk. Hence, a risk premium will be added to the fixed leg. In the longevity bond case, the annuity provider will buy this time a certain number of bonds, paying a given coupon. As for the swap, the bond issuer will ask a certain safety margin to be added to the coupon value. Now, for the longevity swap, we can graph the risk premium on the left and the swap cost versus the longevity solvency capital requirement, or SCR, of the unhedged portfolio, computed by applying a longevity shock of 20% onto the Wang Transform Lee Carter survival probabilities. We can underline that longevity risk over relatively short-term horizons is quite low, as we can see on the risk premium figure, but tends to rise relatively fast over longer runs. The swap cost is lower than the SCR during 30 years. This means that instead of holding the SCR for each of these years, the annuity provider can hold the swap cost instead and use such a money gain for his day-to-day activities. But the swap cost is higher than the SCR after 30 years. Hedging longevity risk is therefore not cost-effective at these ages due to the higher volatility of mortality rates. It is therefore more profitable for the annuity provider to keep such a longevity tail risk on its balance sheet. When it comes to longevity bonds, we can underline similar conclusions as for the longevity swaps, since longevity risk also tends to rise relatively fast over longer time horizons. The bond cost is lower than the SCR a little bit longer than the longevity swap, 35 years here, and the bond cost is higher than the SCR after 35 years. However, the safety margin seems to be way more volatile than the swap risk premium, remaining close to zero for a very long time. Consequently, the more efficient the hedge over the long term, the greater the cost. This is maybe the reason of the recent success of longevity swaps, being less expensive coupled with the fact that they can be customized, as well in order to remove any residual basis risk. The previous analysis concludes this thesis, and a list of future prospects can be drawn as a result of this work, such as cleaning numerical inconsistencies, if any, arising during the analysis of the failure process, extending the work to other types of stochastic mortality models such as two-factor modeling and to multi-cohorts instead of single ones, analyzing the impact of mean reversion, basis risk and counterparty credit risk, investigated other pricing methods than the Wang Transform, and extending the current work to option-type longevity derivatives. We have now come to the end of this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do not hesitate to contact me personally should you have any question about it or about Altaïr services. Thank you all for listening, and goodbye.